Her husband had been dead 3 days when his son came to take the ranch. Margaret heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak of wheels on the gravel road below, 2 horses, a heavy load moving fast for a family in mourning. She was standing on the hill where Robert was buried, close enough to the apple trees that she could smell the bark in the cold morning air. Wyoming April doesn't warm easy. The ground holds its chill long after the calendar says otherwise, and she had been standing there long enough that the cold had worked its way through her boots and up into her bones. She didn't move when she heard the wheels. She just looked at the fresh dirt, dark and raw, a single stem of dried sage she had laid there that morning, because Robert always said sage smelled like honest work. The wagon stopped at the gate below. Now, before we see who climbed down from that wagon, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from today? Drop your state in the comments below. Stories like this one travel farther than most folks realize, and I always enjoy seeing where they land. If you enjoy these old frontier tales, you're always welcome to ride along with us. Now then. Margaret turned from the grave and walked down the hill, and she did not hurry. Robert had been a good man, not a perfect one. No honest woman calls her husband perfect and means it, but good in the ways that counted. He had worked this land 30 years before she came to it, and for 15 years after, they had worked it together, season after season. She knew every fence post, every creek bend, every patch of ground that flooded in March and dried too fast in July. She knew this land the way you know a person you have loved for a long time. And Robert had known something else. He had known this day would come. Victor was already out of the wagon by the time she reached the gate, 30 years old, city coat that had never seen a day of honest work, hands to match. Behind him, his younger brother Thomas waited near the horses, hat in hand, not quite meeting her eyes. Beside the wagon stood Dorothy Cole, Robert's mother, 70 years old and sharp as a skinning knife. The fourth one stayed in the wagon, leather case across his knees. Margaret looked at each of them in turn. Then she opened the gate. The men in that wagon believed they were coming for a ranch. They had no idea what Margaret had been doing for the last 3 days. Peirce explained it the way lawyers explain things, carefully, gently, and without a single word of kindness behind any of it. The ranch had been in the Cole family before Robert's first marriage. Wyoming territorial law recognized blood inheritance above all else. The will was being contested. She had 30 days to vacate the property or respond through a legal representative. 30 days. She had planted those apple trees on the hill in the spring of 1878. She had rebuilt the south fence 3 times with her own hands. She had nursed 2 horses through a fever that killed half the livestock in the county, sat up 4 nights straight by lantern light and not lost a single one. 30 days. Victor looked at her across the table. His expression was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was patient. Dorothy set her coffee cup down untouched. She looked around the kitchen one last time. The stove, the shelves, the curtains, the fireplace. The way a woman looks at a room she has already decided to redecorate. She said they would need to make some changes. Her voice was pleasant as a Sunday hymn. Margaret said nothing. She looked at the fireplace. Robert had laid that first stone himself. She remembered the day clearly. October, cold and bright, his breath making small clouds in the morning air. He had pressed one stone into place and held it a moment longer than the others. Then he had looked over his shoulder and smiled. "This one's special," he had said. She had never asked him what he meant. She was beginning to wonder. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke. Margaret had built that smell into the walls over 15 years. Early mornings at the cast-iron stove, bread on Sundays, the lamp burning low while Robert read and she mended and the wind pressed against the shutters like it was asking to come in. She had not invited these people into that kitchen, but she opened the door anyway, because Robert had raised her better than that, and because God-fearing women in Harlow County did not turn family away from the door, no matter what that family had come to do. Victor walked in first. He did what men like Victor always do when they enter a room that isn't theirs. He looked at everything, not the way a guest looks, the way an appraiser looks. His eyes moved across the stone fireplace Margaret had laid herself in the winter of 1877, across the shelves Robert had built the following spring, across the Bible on the kitchen table, the curtains she had sewn from flour sacks when money was short and pride was all they had. Dorothy followed without a word. She ran one gloved finger along the edge of the windowsill as she passed it. Then she looked at her glove. Thomas stayed near the door. The man with the leather case, Purse was his name, sat down at Margaret's table without being invited. He had a soft handshake and a permanent smile and the kind of voice that made everything sound reasonable even when nothing about it was. He opened the leather case slowly, the way men open things when they want you to feel the weight of what's inside. He laid the papers on the table. Margaret stood at the stove. She poured 4 cups of coffee, because that was what you did. She set 'em down without spilling a drop. Then she folded her hands and waited. They left before sundown. Victor said they would return in the morning with the appraiser. He said it the way men say things when they believe the matter's already settled. Dorothy walked out without looking at Margaret. Purse closed his leather case with a small, precise click that echoed in the quiet kitchen like a period at the end of a sentence. Thomas was last. He stopped at the door, turned back. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something. His mouth opened. Then Victor called his name from outside, and Thomas put his hat on and walked out. The door closed. Margaret stood in the kitchen alone. The coffee cups sat on the table where she had placed them, 3 of them untouched. Only Thomas had drunk his all the way to the bottom, the way Robert had always taught his boys to do. Waste nothing. That had been Robert's rule. Waste nothing and be grateful for what you have. She wondered if Victor remembered that rule. She picked up the cups one by one and washed them at the basin. The water was cold. She didn't bother heating it. Outside the window, the sun was dropping behind the ridge, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of copper and ash. The apple trees on the hill stood dark against it, bare still, too early for the season for leaves, but alive. She knew they were alive because she had tended them every spring for 15 years, and she knew what alive looked like even when it didn't show. She dried her hands on her apron and stood very still. 30 days. The words sat in her chest like a stone. Not panic. Margaret Cole did not panic, had not panicked in 15 years of hard seasons and harder winters, and one terrible February when the creek froze and the roof caved and Robert was down with fever, and she had handled it all alone without saying a word to anyone, because that was simply what needed doing. Not panic, but something close to it, something that lived just underneath the surface where no one could see it. She walked to the fireplace. The kitchen had gone dark around her, but she didn't light the lamp yet. She just stood in front of the stone hearth Robert had built with his own hands and looked at it the way you look at something when you were trying to remember everything about it before it's taken from you. Her fingers moved across the stones, rough and cold and solid, laid one by one in the October of 1877 by a man who had pressed one of them into place and held it a moment longer than the rest. This one's special. She had never asked. She pressed her palm flat against the stones now, one by one, feeling the seams between them, feeling for something she couldn't name. The fire had burned down to coals. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare apple trees on the hill and made a sound like breathing. Robert had known Victor would come. She was certain of that now, certain the way you are certain of things you cannot yet prove but feel in your bones, the same way you feel the Wyoming cold, deep and true and impossible to argue with. He had known, and he had left her something. She just hadn't found it yet. But she would. Margaret Cole had 3 days while they were coming. She had not wasted a single one. They came back at dawn. Margaret heard 'em before the coffee had finished boiling. Wheels on gravel, same as yesterday. But this time there were 2 wagons. The second one carried a man she didn't recognize, small, precise, with a leather satchel and the careful eyes of someone who spent his days deciding what things were worth. The appraiser. She had expected him. She had expected all of it. Margaret poured her coffee, drank half of it standing at the stove, and set the cup down. Then she smoothed her apron, picked up the Bible from the kitchen table and moved it to the shelf where it belonged and walked to the door. She opened it before Victor could knock. He didn't like that. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, just slightly, just for a moment, before the patient expression settled back over his face like a mask he had practiced wearing. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. She stepped aside to let him in, because that was what you did, but she stood straight in the doorway as they passed, and she did not smile, and she did not apologize for the early hour, and she did not offer coffee. Some mornings that was enough. Dorothy came in last. She was wearing a different dress today, darker, stiffer, the kind of dress a woman wears when she means to stay. She walked directly to the fireplace and stood in front of it with her hands clasped and looked at the stones the way you look at something you had already decided belongs to you. Margaret watched her from across the room. She did not look away. The appraiser moved through the house the way water moves through a crack, quietly, steadily, finding every corner without being asked. He opened doors, he measured walls, he wrote things down in a small notebook with a pencil he kept behind his ear. He did not speak to Margaret. He did not look at her. To him, she was simply part of the inventory, something to be noted and moved past. Victor followed him room to room. Dorothy stayed by the fireplace. Thomas stood near the window and looked out at the apple trees on the hill. He had his father's way of standing, weight on the left foot, shoulders slightly forward, like a man who was always half ready to go back to work. Margaret noticed it the way you notice things about people when you're trying very hard not to feel anything about them. She stood at the kitchen table and watched it all. The house Robert had built, the shelves he had put up the spring after they married because she had mentioned once, only once, that she needed a place for her books. The floors she had scrubbed on her hands and knees every Saturday for 15 years. The curtains she had made from flour sacks when the money ran out that first hard winter, and she had not complained once, because complaining didn't fix anything, and Margaret Cole had always preferred fixing things to talking about them. The appraiser came back into the kitchen. He said a number. It was insultingly low. Lower than the south pasture alone was worth, lower than the apple orchard, lower than the stone fireplace that Margaret had laid with her own hands in the October of 1877. Victor nodded like the number was exactly what he had expected. Perce wrote it down. Margaret looked at the fireplace, at the stones, at the one Robert had pressed into place and held a moment longer than the rest. She thought about the night before, about her hands moving across the cold stone in the dark, about the seam she had found between two stones that didn't quite match the others. She thought about what Robert had said, this one's special. She looked back at Victor. She said the number was not acceptable. Victor smiled, the patient smile. There are other numbers, he said. We can discuss them at the end of the 30 days. Margaret walked to the door and opened it. The morning air came in cold and clean off the Wyoming hills. She held the door until they left, every last one of them. That evening, Jed Cooper came by. He didn't knock. Jed never knocked. He had been coming to this ranch for 20 years, first as Robert's neighbor, and then as something closer than that, the kind of friend a man makes once in his life if he is lucky, and holds on to if he is wise. He simply opened the gate, tied his horse to the post the way he always had, and came around to the kitchen door. Margaret had the lamp lit and the papers spread across the table. Jed stopped in the doorway. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door the way Robert used to. Same hook, same motion, so familiar it made her chest tighten for just a moment before she put that away somewhere quiet and got back to the matter at hand. "You read all of it?" he said. "Twice," she said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He was 50 years old, Jed Cooper, with hands that looked like the land had made 'em, rough and brown and permanently calloused in the places where a man grips a fence post or a plow handle or a rope in January when the temperature drops and everything freezes except the work. He picked up the top page and read it slowly. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and waited. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the shutters the way it always did this time of year, low and steady, like it was reminding you that Wyoming was still in charge, no matter what the calendar said. Jed set the page down. "Territorial law," he said. He said it the way men say things they don't like the sound of but can't argue with. Margaret nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. The lamp threw warm light across the papers, across Robert's name printed at the top of the legal document, across Perce's careful signature at the bottom. 30 days, Margaret said. Jed looked at her across the table. "Tell me where to start," he said. They worked until midnight. Jed went through the legal papers line by line while Margaret pulled every document she had from the tin box under the bed: receipts, deeds, correspondence, the record of every transaction she and Robert had made in 15 years of running the ranch together. She laid them out on the table in order by date, the way her father had taught her to keep records, because her father had been a careful man and he had raised a careful daughter. Jed read, Margaret sorted, the lamp burned low between them. The territorial law was clear enough. Robert's ranch had come to him through his father before his first marriage. Blood inheritance took precedence. Victor and Thomas were cold by blood. Margaret was cold by marriage. And in Wyoming in 1889, that was a different thing entirely in the eyes of the law. But law and right were not always the same thing. Margaret knew that. Jed knew that. Most people in Harlow County knew that too, though knowing it and doing something about it were two different matters. She has 15 years of receipts, Jed said finally. Every dollar she put into this land is documented. That counts for something. In a fair court, Margaret said. Jed looked at her. He didn't answer right away. That was one of the things she had always respected about Jed Cooper. He didn't say things to make you feel better. He said things because they were true. It counts for something, he said again, carefully. Margaret nodded. She picked up the last page and read it one more time. Pierce's signature, the territorial seal. 30 days printed in plain black ink like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She set it down. She looked at the fireplace across the room. The coals had burned down to almost nothing, just a faint red glow behind the iron grate, the stones dark and cold in the shadows. Robert's stones, laid one by one in the October of 1877. She thought about what Thomas had said that afternoon when he had passed her in the yard. He hadn't meant to say it. It had come out the way things come out when a person isn't being careful. Father always went back to the fireplace when he had something important to think through. Margaret had stopped walking when she heard it. She hadn't moved for a full 10 seconds. Jed was watching her now from across the table. She didn't explain. She just stood up, took the lamp from the table, and walked slowly across the kitchen to the fireplace. She held the light close to the stones, one by one, until she found the one that was different. She waited until Jed left. She didn't know why exactly, only that this felt like something private, something between her and Robert. The kind of thing a woman does alone at midnight when the lamp is burning low and the wind is pressing against the shutters and the house is finally quiet enough to think. She stood in front of the fireplace for a long time. The stones were cold under her fingers, rough and uneven the way hand-laid stone always is. No two pieces exactly the same size, no two gaps exactly the same width. Robert had not been a mason. He had been a rancher who needed a fireplace and built one the way he built everything else, carefully, stubbornly, and better than anyone expected. She moved her fingers slowly across the surface. Most of the stones were set tight, solid. The mortar between them had dried hard over 12 years and would not give without a chisel and considerable effort. But there, third row from the bottom, slightly left of center, one stone sat different from the rest. Not loose exactly, but not the same. The mortar around it was newer, smoother, applied with more care than the stones beside it. Margaret pressed her palm flat against it, cold, solid, deliberately placed. She thought about Robert's hands, big and careful, and always doing two things at once, the thing you could see and the thing you couldn't see. She thought about the way he had held that stone a moment longer than necessary, the way he had looked at her over his shoulder and smiled. This one's special. She had thought he meant the fireplace. She went to the barn and got the short iron bar Robert kept hanging on the wall beside the harness rack. She carried it back to the kitchen. She set the lamp on the floor close to the hearth, where it would give her the most light. She looked at the stone one more time. Then she set the iron bar and the seam beside it and pushed. The stone moved. The letter was 3 pages long. She read the first line and had to set it down for a moment and press her hands flat on the table and look at the ceiling and breathe. Then she picked it up again and read it through to the end without stopping. Robert had written it 8 days before he died. He had known Victor would come, had known it for years, had watched his oldest son's eyes move across the land every time he visited, counting and calculating behind the patient smile that Margaret now recognized because she had seen it on Victor's face across her own kitchen table. He had known, and he had spent the last good days he had making sure she would not face it alone. The final lines of the letter were short and plain, the way Robert said everything that mattered. I have had the deed notarized and witnessed by Judge Calloway and Laramie. It is in this package. The land is yours, Margaret. I earned it, and I am giving it to you because you earned it with me. Do not let them tell you otherwise. You were never a guest on this ranch. You were always its keeper. Victor will come. I always knew he would. That is why I am writing this now. Margaret sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned out. She sat in the dark with the letter in her hands and the deed on the table in front of her, and outside the wind moved through the bare apple trees on the hill and made a sound like breathing, like Robert breathing. She did not cry. She had done her crying. Now there was work to do. Dorothy Cole had been winning quiet wars her entire life. She had won them the way certain women win things, not with noise, not with lawyers, not with papers laid on kitchen tables, with presence. With the slow, steady pressure of a woman who has decided how things are going to be and simply waits for the world to catch up. Margaret had known women like Dorothy, had grown up watching them operate in church socials and county fairs and the small, careful gatherings where the real business of a community gets done. They moved through rooms the way weather moves through a valley. You didn't always see it coming, but you felt it after. Dorothy started with the kitchen. She arrived the second morning before Victor and rearranged the shelves while Margaret was out checking the south fence. Not everything, just enough. The coffee tin moved to the left of the stove instead of the right. The good plates stacked differently. The Bible, Margaret's Bible, the one her mother had given her the year she married Robert, moved from the shelf to the windowsill. Margaret came in from the cold and stopped in the doorway. She looked at the windowsill. She looked at Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her expression pleasant as a spring morning. Then she walked to the windowsill, picked up the Bible, and put it back on the shelf where it belonged. Dorothy watched her do it. Neither of them said a word. That was how it went for the first 3 days. Small displacements, small corrections. The kind of warfare that leaves no marks and cannot be reported to a judge or a sheriff or anyone who deals in facts rather than atmospheres. Dorothy rearranged. Margaret restored. Dorothy smiled. Margaret did not. The neighbor women started coming by on the fourth day. They came the way neighbor women come in small Wyoming towns, with food and condolences and eyes that missed nothing. Dorothy received them in Margaret's kitchen like a hostess receiving guests in her own home. She poured coffee from Margaret's coffee pot. She cut slices from the pie Mrs. Alderman had brought and served them on Margaret's good plates. She spoke about Robert with great tenderness. She spoke about the ranch with great familiarity. She did not introduce Margaret. Margaret stood at the stove and listened and kept her expression still and thought about the deed in the oilcloth package now locked in the tin box under her bed, and thought about Robert's handwriting, and thought about the words he had written in the last good days he had. You were never a guest on this ranch. You were always its keeper. She held on to that. It was the only thing in that kitchen that nobody could rearrange. Victor came on the fifth day with a new offer. He came alone this time. No purse, no Thomas, no appraiser with his leather satchel and his insulting numbers. Just Victor, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his hands folded and his patient smile and an envelope he slid across the table toward her without being asked. Margaret did not touch it. He explained the offer the way he explained everything, reasonably, quietly, like a man doing a favor for someone who didn't deserve one. The number was higher than the appraiser's figure, not by much. Enough to start somewhere else, he said, somewhere without complications, somewhere fresh. He used the word fresh twice. Margaret looked out the window at the apple trees on the hill, bare still. Wyoming hauled April holds its cold and its bare branches long past the point of patience, but alive. She knew they were alive. She had tended them every spring for 15 years, and she knew what alive looked like, even when it didn't show. Robert had planted those trees the first year they were married. She had pruned them every autumn. She had wrapped their bases in the winters when the temperature dropped past the point where bark could protect itself. She had stood on a ladder in the October wind and picked every apple by hand, because Robert said a fruit left on the tree past its time was a waste, and Robert did not believe in waste. She looked back at Victor. She pushed the envelope back across the table. Victor's patient smile did not waver. He picked up the envelope and tucked it back inside his coat and nodded once, like a man making a note of something. "We have 25 days remaining," he said. Margaret stood up. She walked to the door and opened it. The morning air came in off the hill, cold and clean and smelling of sage and pine and the particular freshness of Wyoming land that has been rained on in the night. Victor called his offer generous as he passed her in the doorway. Margaret didn't correct him. She just watched him walk to his wagon, watched him climb up, watched him turn the horses and move back down the gravel road toward town without looking back. Then she closed the door. She stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, the Bible on the shelf where she had put it, the coffee tin on the right side of the stove where it belonged, the curtains she had sewn from flour sacks in the first hard winter hanging straight and even in the window. Everything where she had put it, everything still hers. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door, the hook Robert had put up the first week they were married because she had mentioned once that she needed somewhere to hang it, and she went outside to finish checking the south fence. There was always work to do, and work, Margaret Cole had learned, was the best answer to men who believed patience was the same thing as winning. She found him in the barn on the 6th morning. Thomas, youngest of Robert's sons, 24 years old, crouched in the corner of the tack room with a length of broken harness across his knees and a needle and thread in his hands. He was stitching the leather back together with the careful, concentrated look of someone who has been taught to finish what he starts. Margaret stopped in the doorway. Nobody had asked him to do that. The harness had been broken since February, one of those repairs that kept getting pushed back behind more urgent things, the way small repairs always do on a working ranch. She had noticed it 3 weeks ago and made a note to get to it, and then Robert had gotten sick and the note had gotten lost in everything that followed. Thomas looked up when he heard her. He didn't apologize for being there. He didn't explain himself. He just looked at her steadily with Robert's eyes, the same gray, the same directness, the same quality of seeing more than he let on, and then looked back down at the harness. Margaret walked to the workbench and picked up the task she had come in for, a bridle that needed a new buckle. She sat down on the bench and worked in silence, and Thomas worked in silence, and outside the wind moved through the bare trees, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and the barn smelled the way barns always smelled, hay and leather, and the particular warmth of large animals in an enclosed space. It was Thomas who spoke first. He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way people say things they have been holding for a while and finally just let go of. "Father was happy here," he said. Margaret kept her eyes on the bridle. "Happier than I ever saw him anywhere else," Thomas said. He paused. "I used to wonder what it was about this place." He looked around the barn, at the neat rows of tools, the organized tack, the swept floor. "Then I figured it out." Margaret waited. "It wasn't the place," Thomas said. He set the harness down and looked at her. "It was you." Margaret set the bridle down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a horse shifted in its stall, and the wind pressed against the barn wall, and somewhere up on the hill a crow called once and went quiet. "Thank you," she said finally. She said it simply because it was all there was to say, and because Thomas had said a true thing, and true things deserved to be received plainly. Thomas nodded. He picked the harness back up and went back to his stitching. They worked in silence for a while, comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have both learned that most of what needs saying doesn't need saying out loud. Margaret had recognized it in Jed. She recognized it now in Thomas and understood that he had gotten it from his father, the same way you get certain things from people you grow up watching. She was almost finished with the buckle when Thomas spoke again. He said it the same way he had said the first thing, quietly, almost to himself, like a thought that slipped out before he could decide whether to keep it. "Father had a habit," he said, "when he had something important to work through. something he couldn't quite figure out yet. He'd go stand by the fireplace. Just stand there, sometimes for an hour. Victor used to joke about it, said Father treated that fireplace like a confessional. He smiled faintly at the memory, a small, private smile. Margaret's hands went still on the bridle. She looked at Thomas. He wasn't looking at her. He was focused on the harness, pulling the thread through with the careful patience of someone who has been taught that a thing worth doing is worth doing right. He didn't seem to realize what he had said. Or maybe he did. Margaret looked back down at the buckle in her hands. She turned it over once, twice. Her mind was very quiet, the way it gets sometimes when something important has just fallen into place and you need a moment to understand the shape of it. "That fireplace," she said. Her voice came out even, careful. Thomas looked up. "He built it himself," she said. "Did you know that?" Thomas shook his head. "I didn't know that." "First winter we were married," Margaret said. "Laid every stone himself. Took him 3 weeks. She paused. "He was particular about it. Said he wanted it done right." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back down at the harness. "Sounds like him," he said quietly. Margaret finished the buckle. She set the bridle on the hook and stood up and dusted her hands on her apron. She thanked Thomas for the harness work. He said it was nothing. She said it wasn't nothing, and she meant it. She walked back to the house through the cold morning air. She did not go straight to the kitchen. She went to the fireplace. She stood in front of it the way Robert used to stand, weight forward, hands at her sides, looking at the stones, all of them, one by one, until her eyes found the one that was different, 3rd row from the bottom, slightly left of center, the mortar around it smoother than the rest. She stood there for a long time. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about a man who built answers into walls. And in the morning, before anyone arrived, she went to the barn and got the iron bar. She waited until the house was completely quiet. Jed had gone home an hour before. The lamp in the spare room where Dorothy had installed herself without being invited had gone dark. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. That particular stillness that comes to Wyoming in the deep middle of the night when even the weather seems to be holding its breath. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes, not thinking exactly, more like listening to the house, to the sounds it made when no one was demanding anything of it, the tick of the stove cooling, the faint creak of the floorboard near the back door that had been creaking in cold weather since 1881, and that she had never gotten around to fixing because Robert always said it was useful, like a bell that told you someone was coming in from the barn. She thought about Robert. She thought about the way he had pressed that one stone into place and held it a moment longer than the rest, the way he had looked at her over his shoulder, the particular quality of his smile in that moment, not his everyday smile, not the smile he used when he was pleased about the harvest or amused by something Jed had said. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, she understood now, like a man keeping a secret he intended to tell her eventually. He just hadn't expected eventually to come so soon. Margaret stood up. She took the iron bar from where she had leaned it against the wall beside the hearth that afternoon. She took the lamp from the table and turned it down low, low enough to see by, not so bright that it would show under Dorothy's door. She set it on the hearth floor. She knelt in front of the fireplace, third row from the bottom, slightly left of center. She pressed her fingers against the stone, cold and solid and slightly different from the ones beside it, the mortar around it smoother, applied with more deliberation, the work of a man who wanted something to stay hidden but wanted it findable by the right person at the right time. She set the iron bar into the seam along the left edge of the stone. She pushed. The stone moved. Not much, just enough, a quarter inch of give that the stones beside it didn't have. Margaret's breath came out slow and careful. She adjusted the bar, pushed again. The stone scraped against its neighbors with a sound that seemed enormous in the quiet kitchen, and she stopped and listened and heard nothing from the spare room and kept going. On the third push, the stone came free. She caught it with both hands before it could fall and set it carefully on the hearth floor beside her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs for a moment until they steadied. Then she held the lamp up to the hollow behind the stone. It was there. Everything Robert had left her, right where he had always known she would find it. She lifted the package out carefully. Oilcloth, tied with leather cord, the kind of careful wrapping a man does when he wants something to last, to stay dry and intact through seasons and years and whatever comes after he is no longer there to protect it himself. Margaret carried it to the kitchen table. She untied the cord slowly, not because she was afraid of what was inside, because this was the last thing Robert had done for her, and she wanted to be present for it, fully present, the way you are present for things that cannot be undone or repeated. She pulled back the oilcloth. The ledger was on top, 15 years of her own handwriting staring back at her, every transaction, every improvement, every dollar earned and spent on this land recorded in the careful columns her father had taught her to keep. She set it aside. Beneath the ledger was an envelope, her name on the outside, Robert's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, had recognized it across a room for 15 years, the particular slant of his letters, the way he pressed harder on the downstrokes than the upstrokes, a habit he had never broken from his schoolboy days. The handwriting was shakier than she remembered. He had written this when he was already sick. She opened the envelope. 3 pages. She read them straight through without stopping, and when she finished, she set them down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Robert had known about Victor for years, had watched him, had understood what his oldest son was, not evil, not cruel, simply a man shaped by want in a way that had never been corrected. He had tried to correct it, had failed, had accepted the failure with the particular quiet sorrow of a father who loves his children clearly enough to see them plainly. He had gone to Laramie in January, 3 months before he died, when he was sick enough to know what was coming, but well enough to still sit a wagon. He had found Judge Calloway, an old friend, a man Robert had known since territorial days, and he had had the deed to the ranch notarized and witnessed and recorded in the territorial land office in Margaret's name. Not in both their names, in hers,
solely and completely, and with a written statement of intent that Peirce and his leather case and all of Victor's patience could not undo. The last paragraph of the letter was short.
You were never a guest on this ranch, Margaret. You were always its keeper. I knew that the first winter when you fixed the south fence in the January cold without being asked, and didn't mention it until spring. That is when I knew. Victor will come. I always knew he would. That is why I am writing this now. The land is yours. You earned it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. R. Margaret sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned out. She sat in the dark with the letter in her hands and the deed on the table in front of her and the ledger open beside it. And outside the wind had come back now, moving through the bare apple trees on the hill the way it always did this time of year. She thought about Robert standing at that fireplace, all those times she had seen him there, weight forward, hands at his sides, looking at the stones. She had thought he was thinking about the ranch, about the weather, about whatever men think about when they stand in front of fires at the end of long days. He had been thinking about her. He had been thinking about this. She did not cry. She had done her crying, 3 days of it, quietly, alone, the way she did everything that mattered, without witnesses, without drama, without asking anyone to carry what she could carry herself. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope inside the ledger. She wrapped everything back in the oilcloth and tied the leather cord and carried the package to the tin box under her bed and locked it. Then she went back to the kitchen and picked up the stone from the hearth floor and fitted it back into its place in the fireplace. She pressed it in with both hands, held it there a moment longer than necessary, the way Robert had. Then she went to bed. Tomorrow, Peirce was coming. She was ready for him. Peirce came alone on the 12th day. No Victor, no Dorothy, no appraiser with his leather satchel and his insulting numbers. Just Peirce, arriving at the gate on a gray gelding at 10 in the morning with his permanent smile and his careful eyes and the particular ease of a man who believes he's about to close a difficult negotiation. Margaret saw him coming from the kitchen window. She put the kettle on. He knocked this time, which told her something. When Victor came, he walked in like a man entering a room that already belonged to him. Peirce knocked because Peirce was careful. Peirce understood that the way you approach a door tells people things about you, and Peirce did not like people knowing things about him that he hadn't chosen to share. She let him knock twice before she opened it. He came in and sat down at the table without being asked, the same chair he always took, the one that faced the fireplace. Margaret had noticed that, the way his eyes went to the fireplace every time he entered the kitchen, not with any particular meaning, just the habit of a man who notices things and files them away. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. He thanked her. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way people do when they want to appear relaxed. He looked around the kitchen with the pleasant expression of a man on a social call. Then he opened his coat and took out an envelope. He said the number inside was 3 times the appraiser's figure. He said Victor had authorized him to offer it as a final settlement. He said the offer was generous. He used that word the same way Victor used it, Margaret noticed, which told her something about how much time the two of them had spent together preparing for this conversation. He said she could have the money within the week. He said she could start fresh somewhere without the weight of a contested estate and complicated family arrangements and the particular loneliness of a woman living alone on a working ranch with no one to help her through the hard seasons. He said that last part gently, almost kindly. Margaret looked at him across the table. She thought about Robert and Laramie in January, sick enough to know what was coming, sitting across from Judge Calloway in the Territorial Land Office with shaking hands and a clear mind and 15 years of certainty about who had earned what on the ranch he was leaving behind. She thought about the letter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank it slowly. She set it down. She looked at the envelope on the table. She did not touch it. Perce was watching her with the patient expression of a man who has learned that silence is a negotiating tool and that most people will fill it if you wait long enough. He had probably learned that in a courtroom somewhere. It was a good technique. It worked on most people. Margaret let the silence sit. Outside, a horse moved in the pasture. The stove ticked. Somewhere up on the hill, a bird called once, the first bird song she had heard since February, which meant spring was finally deciding to show up whether Wyoming wanted it or not. She thought about what Jed had said the night before. He had come by after supper, and she had told him about the deed and the letter, and he had sat across from her at this same table and read every word Robert had written, and when he finished, he had folded the letter carefully and handed it back and said nothing for a long moment. Then he had said, "The judge that notarized this deed, Calloway, I know that name." Margaret had waited. Jed had looked at her steadily. "Calloway's an honest man," he said. "Old school. Territorial appointment going back 20 years. If Robert had this deed recorded through Calloway, it'll hold up in any court in Wyoming." Margaret had nodded. Then Jed had said the other thing, the thing she had been turning over ever since. "Perce knows it too," Jed said. "That's why he's coming alone tomorrow. Victor sends lawyers alone when he wants something settled quietly, before it gets to a courtroom where the record becomes public." Margaret looked at Perce across the table now. She thought about that. She picked up the envelope and looked at it for a moment, felt the weight of it, then she set it back down on the table and slid it slowly back across toward him. Perce's smile did not change, but something behind it did, something small and precise, like a clock adjusting for a change in temperature. He said the offer would not be extended again. Margaret stood up. She carried both coffee cups to the basin. She rinsed them out the way she rinsed everything, thoroughly, without rushing, giving the task the attention it deserved. Then she dried her hands on her apron and turned around. Perce was still sitting at her table. She walked to the door and opened it. The morning air came in clean and cold off the Wyoming hills, sage and pine and the faint smell of rain coming in from the west. She looked at Perce. He picked up the envelope. He buttoned his coat. He stood up from her table and walked to the door and paused on the threshold the way men pause when they want to leave you with something to think about. She told him the coffee had gone cold. He understood what she meant. He walked to his horse without looking back. Margaret closed the door. She stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Then she went to the window and watched him ride back down the gravel road toward town, watched until the gray gelding disappeared around the bend and the sound of hooves faded into the wind.
Then she went to the tin box under her bed. She unlocked it. She took out the oilcloth package and carried it to the kitchen table and set it down and put both hands on top of it and stood there for a moment. Thomas had not come by today. She had not seen him since their conversation in the barn 2 days ago, had not seen his horse at the gate. She didn't know what that meant. She hoped it meant what she thought it meant. But hope, Margaret Cole had learned, was not the same thing as certainty, and she needed certainty now.
Jed was waiting at the gate with the wagon. He had dressed carefully, too. Clean shirt, good coat, hat brushed. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without making a production of it, and they drove into town in the early morning quiet with the frost still on the ground and the Wyoming sky enormous and pale blue above them. They did not talk much on the drive. There was not much to say that hadn't already been said. The courthouse was a 2-story frame building on Main Street of Harlow, modest by territorial standards, but solid, the kind of building that meant to be taken seriously. A small crowd had gathered outside. Word had gotten around the county the way word always gets around small places, thoroughly and faster than anyone intends. Margaret looked straight ahead as Jed brought the wagon to a stop. Victor's buggy was already there, and beside it another horse she didn't recognize, a big bay tied to the post with the careful nod of a man who expected to be inside for a while. She looked at Jed. He looked at the bay horse. Neither of them said anything, but Margaret felt something shift in the bottom of her stomach, something that felt uncomfortably like the first edge of fear. The hearing was set for the 20th day. Not a full trial, Perce had been careful about that. A preliminary hearing before Judge Aldrich in the Harlow County Courthouse to determine whether the contested will had sufficient grounds to proceed to territorial court. If Aldrich ruled against Margaret at this stage, the case would move up and the costs would move with it, and Perce knew as well as anyone that a woman running a ranch alone did not have the kind of money that territorial court proceedings required. It was a good strategy. Margaret understood it clearly. She had spent the 3 days before the hearing going through every document in the tin box with Jed sitting across from her at the kitchen table. They had organized everything by date and by type. The deed first, then the letter, then the ledger with its 15 years of careful entries. Jed had written out a summary in his plain, straightforward hand that laid out the sequence of events without embellishment or argument, because Jed understood that facts presented plainly were more convincing than facts presented passionately. The morning of the hearing was cold and bright. Margaret dressed carefully. Her good dress, dark blue wool, high collar, the one she wore to church on Sundays and to the county fair in August and to Robert's funeral 3 weeks ago. She pinned her hair up the way her mother had taught her. She put on her good boots and polished them the night before until she could see her reflection in the leather. She picked up the tin box. Judge Aldrich was a compact, gray-haired man who had been sitting on the Harlow County bench for 14 years, and who had the particular expression of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible dispute and has stopped being surprised by any of them. He called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock. Perce spoke first. He was good. Margaret had known he would be good, had prepared herself for it, but knowing a thing and experiencing it were different matters. He laid out the case with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who has done his preparation and trusts his preparation and knows that the other side does not have what he has. Territorial inheritance law, the Cole family land grant, Robert's first marriage, the legal standing of blood heirs versus spousal claims in contested estate cases. He cited 3 precedents from territorial court decisions going back to 1871. He presented a certified copy of the original land grant made out to Robert's father in 1861. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes. When he finished, Judge Aldrich looked at Margaret. She stood up. She presented the deed first, laid it on the judge's bench, and explained its provenance clearly. Laramie, January, Judge Calloway, the Territorial Land Office. She presented Robert's letter. She presented the ledger. She spoke for 12 minutes. When she finished, there was a silence in the courtroom that felt like the silence before weather. Judge Aldrich picked up the deed. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and picked up the letter and read that. Then he looked at Perce. Perce was already on his feet. He said the deed was not in question. He said the letter was not in question. What was in question, he said, was whether a deed transfer and sole ownership to a spouse superseded the territorial inheritance rights of blood heirs under the Wyoming Territorial Code of 1869. He paused. He said it did not. He cited the specific statute, Section 14, Paragraph 3. He read it aloud in the quiet courtroom in his careful, reasonable voice, and the words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Judge Aldrich looked at the deed again. Then he looked at Margaret. He said he was inclined to agree with Mr. Perce's reading of the statute. He said the deed established intent, but that intent alone was insufficient under territorial law without a corresponding legal instrument that met the specific requirements of Section 14. He said the ledger, while thorough and clearly maintained, did not constitute a legal claim to ownership under Wyoming Territorial Code. He said he would need to consider whether the case had sufficient grounds to proceed. Perce smiled. Victor sat very still, with his hands folded on the table in front of him and his patient expression firmly in place. Margaret looked at Jed. Jed looked back at her. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. The courtroom was very quiet. And then the door at the back opened. Everyone turned. Thomas Cole stood in the doorway. He was dusty from hard riding. His hat was in his hand. He looked at Victor first, held his brother's gaze for a long, steady moment, and then he looked at Judge Aldrich. He said he had documents the court needed to see. Perce's smile finally disappeared. Thomas walked to the front of the courtroom. He moved the way his father had moved, steadily, without hurry, with the particular gravity of a man who has made a decision and made his peace with it and is no longer interested in reconsidering. He did not look at Victor again. He did not look at Dorothy, who was sitting in the second row with her hands folded and an expression that Margaret could not read from where she sat. He looked at Judge Aldrich. He set the envelope on the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Thomas Cole. Robert Cole was my father." He paused. "These are letters my father wrote to Margaret Cole before their marriage. I found them in my mother's belongings after she passed 3 years ago. I have had them since then." Judge Aldrich looked at the envelope. He looked at Thomas. He picked up the envelope and opened it and removed the letters and began to read. The courtroom was absolutely still. Margaret looked at her hands on the table in front of her. She was aware of Jed beside her, the steadiness of him, the warmth of his presence in the cold courtroom. And she was aware of Victor across the aisle, and she was aware of Perce standing very still, with his permanent smile finally completely gone. She looked at Thomas. He was looking at her. He gave a small nod, the kind of nod that doesn't need explaining. Judge Aldrich read for 4 minutes. Then he set the letters down and removed his glasses and cleaned them with his handkerchief, a deliberate, unhurried gesture that told Margaret he was thinking and wanted time to think. He put his glasses back on. He said the letters established a pattern of intent going back more than 16 years. He said Robert Cole had written explicitly and repeatedly about his wish that the ranch pass to Margaret in the event of his death. He said that combined with the notarized deed and the recorded transfer at the Territorial Land Office in Laramie, this constituted a legal instrument that did in fact meet the requirements of Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Wyoming Territorial Code of 1869.
He said he was ruling in favor of Margaret Cole. He said the ranch was hers. He said it plainly and without ceremony, the way judges say things when they have made up their minds and want everyone in the room to understand that the matter is settled. Perce picked up his leather case. Victor stood up. He opened his mouth. Perce put a hand on his arm, quietly, firmly, and Victor closed his mouth and stood very still for a moment, and then sat back down. Dorothy did not move. She sat in the second row with her hands still folded and looked at the front of the courtroom with an expression that Margaret understood was not anger exactly. It was something older than anger, something that had been there a long time and was simply now visible. Margaret stood up. Her legs were steady. She was surprised by that, had half expected them not to be, but they were, solid under her the way the Wyoming ground was solid, the way the ranch was solid, the way 15 years of honest work was solid when you finally got to stand on top of it. She looked at Thomas. He was still standing near the bench, still holding his hat, still looking at her with Robert's eyes. She crossed the courtroom to him. She said, "Thank you." She said it quietly so only he could hear. Thomas looked down at his hat for a moment. Then he looked up. He said, "She earned it." He said, "Father knew that." He said, "I knew it too. I just needed to decide what kind of man I wanted to be about it." He put his hat on. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking to Victor. Margaret watched him go. And then she felt Jed beside her, not touching her, just there, the way he was always just there. And she turned and picked up the tin box from the table and held it against her chest and walked out of the Harlow County Courthouse into the cold, bright Wyoming morning. Jed was one step behind her. He didn't say anything. He just handed her her coat. She put it on, and for the first time in 20 days, she felt the cold the way you feel cold when you are no longer afraid of it. Just cold, just Wyoming, just hers.
They drove home in the early afternoon. The frost had melted off the road by then, and the wagon wheels threw up small sprays of mud on the turns, and the Wyoming sky had gone from pale blue to the deeper, richer blue that comes in the middle of clear, cold days when the light is at its best. Margaret sat on the wagon seat with the tin box on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and watched the land come back to her as they drove. The south pasture first, then the creek bend where the willows were just beginning to show the first faint green of new growth along their branches, then the long, straight stretch of fence line she had rebuilt 3 summers ago, post by post, wire by wire, 2 weeks of work in August heat that had left her hands raw and her shoulders aching for a month after. All of it hers. All of it still hers. Jed drove without speaking. He was good at that, at being present without requiring anything from the presence. Robert had been the same way. She had noticed it the first winter she was on the ranch, how the two of them could work side by side for hours without talking, and it never felt like silence the way silence sometimes feels, heavy, loaded, demanding to be filled. It just felt like 2 people who were comfortable enough with each other not to need noise between them. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him walking into that courtroom, dusty from hard riding, with the envelope in his hand, and Robert's eyes, and the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what kind of man he wants to be. She wondered where he had gone after, whether he had gone back to Victor, whether Victor would forgive him, whether forgiveness was even the right word for what would need to happen between those 2 brothers now. She didn't know. It wasn't her to know. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last bend, the house first, then the barn, then the apple trees on the hill behind it, bare and dark against the afternoon sky. The gate was closed the way she had left it that morning, everything exactly as she had left it. Jed brought the wagon to a stop at the gate. He set the brake and climbed down and opened the gate and led the horses through and closed it behind him with the particular care of a man who closes gates because he understands why gates exist. Margaret climbed down from the wagon. She stood for a moment in the yard. She looked at the house, at the stone chimney rising from the kitchen end, Robert's chimney, Robert's stones, the one particular stone 3rd row from the bottom, slightly left of center, that she had pressed back into place in the dark of the kitchen 2 weeks ago and had not touched since. She looked at the hill, at the apple trees, at the dark, raw earth of the grave near the top, where the ground was beginning to firm up now as the April cold slowly, grudgingly gave way. She stood there for a long time. Jed stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. Some things don't need saying. She wondered where he had gone after, whether he had gone back to Victor, whether Victor would forgive him, whether forgiveness was even the right word for what would need to happen between those two brothers now. She didn't know. It wasn't her to know. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last bend, the house first, then the barn, then the apple trees on the hill behind it, bare and dark against the afternoon sky. The gate was closed the way she had left it that morning, everything exactly as she had left it. Jed brought the wagon to a stop at the gate. He set the brake and climbed down and opened the gate and led the horses through and closed it behind them with the particular care of a man who closes gates because he understands why gates exist. Margaret climbed down from the wagon. She stood for a moment in the yard. She looked at the house, at the stone chimney rising from the kitchen end, Robert's chimney, Robert's stones, the one particular stone, third row from the bottom, slightly left of center, that she had pressed back into place in the dark of the kitchen 2 weeks ago and had not touched since. She looked at the hill, at the apple trees, at the dark raw earth of the grave near the top, where the ground was beginning to firm up now as the April cold slowly, grudgingly gave way. She stood there for a long time. Jed stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. Some things don't need saying.
Victor's buggy was gone. She noticed it when they came around to the front of the house, the empty space at the hitching post where his buggy had stood every morning for 20 days. The ground still marked with the particular impressions of his horse's hooves and his wagon wheels, but the buggy itself gone, and Dorothy's traveling trunk gone from the porch where it had sat since the 3rd day, and the spare room window dark for the first time since they had arrived. They had left while she was in court. She stood on the porch and looked at the empty hitching post for a moment. She had expected to feel something larger than what she felt, relief perhaps, or satisfaction, the particular vindication of a woman who has been told she does not belong somewhere and has proved otherwise. She had expected it to feel like winning. It felt quieter than that. It felt like the end of something that had taken up a great deal of space and was now simply over, like weather that is finally moved through. You are glad it is gone, but you are also tired in the particular way that comes after sustained effort, and you do not yet have the energy to be glad. Jed went to see to the horses. Margaret went inside. The kitchen was exactly as she had left it that morning. Coffee cup rinsed and drying on the rack, Bible on the shelf, curtains straight in the window. But something felt different, not wrong, just different, the particular quality of air in a room that has been empty for a while and is now occupied again by the right person. She put the tin box on the table. She opened it. She took out the oilcloth package and unwrapped it and laid the deed and the letter and the ledger on the table in front of her. She looked at 'em for a long moment. Robert's handwriting on the letter, her own handwriting in the ledger, Judge Calloway's seal on the deed.
15 years of a life together, documented in ink and paper and the territorial seal of Wyoming. She heard Jed come in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, "You should eat something." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without apology, as a simple statement of fact rather than a suggestion. Margaret almost smiled. She said she reckoned she should. She put the documents back in the oilcloth and tied the leather cord and put the package back in the tin box and locked it. Then she went to the stove and built up the fire and put the kettle on and started supper the way she started every supper, methodically, without fuss, moving around her kitchen with the ease of a woman who knows exactly where everything is because she put it there herself. Jed sat down at the table. He picked up the ledger that she had left out and turned it over in his hands and set it down again. He said, "Robert was a careful man." Margaret said, "He was." Jed said, "He loved you." Margaret kept her eyes on the stove. She said, "I know." The fire built slowly behind the iron grate. The kettle began its low preliminary hum before the boil. Outside, the light was going, the long Wyoming evening settling in from the west, the sky going from blue to gold to the deep amber that comes just before dark. Margaret looked out the window at the apple trees on the hill, bare still, but alive. She knew they were alive. She had tended them for 15 years, and she knew what alive looked like, even when it didn't show. Spring was coming. It always came.
Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, grudgingly, in fits and starts. 2 warm days followed by a cold snap that froze the creek overnight and left a thin skin of ice on the water trough that Margaret broke with the heel of her boot each morning. Then 3 more warm days. Then rain, real rain, the kind that meant it, soaking into the ground and staying there instead of running off the frozen surface the way the early spring rains did. Then, one morning, she woke up and the air smelled different. She lay in bed for a moment with her eyes open and the window gray with early light and just breathed it in, the particular smell of Wyoming ground that has finally let go of its cold, earth and sage and something green underneath, the smell of things that have been waiting a long time, finally deciding to move. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window with the cup in both hands and looked at the hill behind the house, at the apple trees. They had leaves, small ones, pale and new and tentative the way first leaves always are, as if they aren't entirely sure yet that it's safe to come out. But there, unmistakably there, green against the brown of the bare branches and the gray of the Wyoming sky and the dark earth of Robert's grave near the top of the hill. Margaret set her coffee cup down.
She went to the barn and got the box of seedlings she had started in the window of the spare room 3 weeks ago, the room that had been Dorothy's for 20 days and was now a spare room again, smelling of the sage bundles Margaret had hung in it after they left clear the air. 6 apple seedlings in 6 clay pots, small and fragile looking, the kind of thing that required patience and attention and the willingness to tend something for years before it gave anything back. She carried the box up the hill. The ground was soft under her boots, soft and dark and giving, the best digging ground of the year, the brief window between frozen and dry when the earth cooperates with you instead of fighting you. She set the box down near the top of the hill. She stood for a moment at Robert's grave. The dried sage she had laid there the morning after the funeral was still there, weathered now, bleached by the weeks of cold and wind, but still there. She straightened it. She stood with her hand on the simple wooden marker Jed had made and looked out over the ranch below. The south pasture, the creek bend with its willows, the long fence line she had rebuilt 3 summers ago, the barn, the house with its stone chimney, all of it hers, all of it still hers. She heard boots on the hill behind her. She knew the sound of those boots. She did not turn around right away. She just looked out over the ranch and let him come up the hill the way Jed always came, steadily, without hurry, arriving exactly when he was needed. Jed stopped beside her. He looked at the grave. Then he looked out over the ranch the way she had been looking, taking it in the way you take in something you've known a long time and are still not tired of seeing. He had a shovel over his shoulder. He had known she'd be up here today. She hadn't told him. He had simply known, the way Jed knew most things about the rhythm of this ranch and the woman who ran it. He had probably seen the box of seedlings missing from the spare room window and picked up the shovel without thinking about it, the way you pick up what's needed without being asked when you had been paying attention long enough. He set the shovel in the ground beside the first marked spot. They worked in silence. Jed dug. Margaret set each seedling into its hole carefully, roots spread, depth right, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, in a different state, in a different life, that had nevertheless made her exactly the person she needed to be for this one. She packed the earth around each one with her hands, pressed it firm, the way you press something into place when you want it to hold, the way Robert had pressed that stone. The sun came out from behind the clouds while they worked, warm and direct, the way Wyoming sun is in late April when it finally means it. It fell across the hill and across the new leaves on the old apple trees and across the dark earth of Robert's grave and across Margaret's hands, pressing the last seedling into the ground. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the 6 small trees, fragile and new and improbably hopeful in the way of all new things. She looked at the old trees, the ones Robert had planted the first year they were married, thick-trunked now, solid, the kind of trees that had stopped asking permission from the weather and simply grown regardless. She had tended those trees for 15 years. She would tend these for whatever came next. Jed crouched beside her. He picked up a handful of the dark soil and turned it in his fingers the way farmers do, feeling the texture, the moisture, the particular quality of ground that has been well tended over many years. "Good soil," he said. Margaret looked at it. She thought about everything that had gone into that soil. 15 years of work, 15 years of seasons, the south fence rebuilt 3 times, the horses nursed through fever, the creek channel dug in the summer heat, the ledger filled line by careful line with the record of a life spent learning this land and being learned by it in return. She thought about Robert in Laramie in January with shaking hands and a clear mind. She thought about Thomas walking into that courtroom dusty from hard riding. She thought about Jed at the kitchen table reading Robert's letter with his jaw tight and his hands flat, and then looking up and saying, "Tell me where to start." She thought about Dorothy's gloved finger on her windsill. She thought about Victor's patient smile. She thought about Percy's leather case clicking shut. And then she thought about something else.
She thought about the woman who had arrived on this ranch 15 years ago, younger, less certain, still learning the difference between the person she had been raised to be and the person she was actually going to become. That woman had worked hard, had asked for nothing, had assumed that the ground beneath her feet belonged to someone else and that her place on it was contingent on the grace of others. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had pressed a stone back into a fireplace in the dark of a Wyoming kitchen and understood, finally, completely, without any remaining doubt, that the house around that fireplace was hers, not because a judge had said so, not because a deed said so, because she had built it, because she had stayed when staying was hard, and worked when working was thankless, and tended what needed tending through 15 years of seasons that asked everything of her, and gave back slowly and incompletely and on their own schedule, the way land always does. She had earned every inch of it. Robert had known that. Now she knew it too. Jed was watching her.
She became aware of it gradually, the quality of his attention, the particular stillness of a man who is looking at something he finds important and is trying to be careful about how he looks at it. She turned her head. He was close, closer than strictly necessary for two people crouching beside a newly planted tree on a hillside. Close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago, and the gray at his temples that had come in slowly over the same years that her own hair had changed, and close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold April air, the way you feel a fire before you see it. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Below them, the ranch lay quiet in the afternoon light. The south pasture, the creek, the barn, the house with Robert's chimney rising solid against the sky. All of it hers. She looked back at the seedlings, 6 small trees in dark Wyoming soil, years away from bearing anything, requiring patience and attention and the willingness to tend something long before it gives anything back. She put her hand on the earth beside the last one, just for a moment. Jed put his hand beside hers, not on top of it, just beside it, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin without either of them having to decide what that meant yet. She left her hand where it was. The wind moved through the old apple trees behind him, a soft sound, almost like breathing, and the new leaves caught the light, and the Wyoming sky went on forever in every direction the way it always had and always would, regardless of what small human dramas played out beneath it. Margaret Cole looked out over her land. For the first time in 15 years, she did not think of it as Robert's land that she lived on. She thought of it as hers. Not the land of a wife, not the land of a widow, not land she had been given or inherited or fought for in a courthouse on a cold April morning. Her land, land she had earned, land she had kept, land she would tend for every season that remained to her. And sitting on that hill, with the smell of good earth on her hands and the sun on her face, and Jed beside her, saying nothing because nothing needed saying, Margaret Cole finally felt at home, not just on the land, in herself.